So, welcome everyone. My name is Brock Allen. I'm here from Developmentor, and we're going to do a webinar here on Knockout.js. Here is actually just one last sound check. Mary, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sounds good.
Okay, excellent. All right, we'll go ahead and get started then. So, again, my name is Brock Allen. Here's my contact information, so you guys should feel free to ping me if you guys have questions about this webinar or anything else related to what we talk about. Just about me real quick. I've been teaching for Developmentor for many, many years now, 13, 14 or so in there somewhere. And I've been doing .NET and ASP.NET ever since that stuff's been out, so I guess 10-ish plus years now on that. I also am a MVP for ASP.NET. I work on a lot of open source projects, so related to ASP.NET and web security. So you guys can check this out from my my blog, and there are various links off to the things I work on. The demos for this webinar are going to be made available afterwards. So right now, that's my SkyDrive share for this this topic. Right now, it's empty. So if you go up there, since I haven't done any of my demos yet, it'll be empty. So, but anyway, afterwards that will be up there. And it's actually at the very end, or actually maybe right now, let's do this just to give it to you guys. I'll go ahead and copy and paste this in there into the chat window. I have a feeling that everyone will be able to see that. Let's do chat. Here we go. I'm going to paste this in there. So the demos, that's the link for you guys, so you guys can get that. Okay, I'll go ahead and paste that at the end as well, but just for now, just so you guys have the URL, because it's a case-sensitive URL. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. So what we're going to do is talk about Knockout. Knockout is a JavaScript library that was originally developed by a guy named Steve Sanderson, and he works for Microsoft, but this is not a Microsoft official library. This is something he's worked on in his spare time. Microsoft, for some of the more recent ASP.NET templates, they are using this library, and it is an open source library so that you guys can use it in your own projects, and I suppose contribute back and check it out. It's up on GitHub. Just real quickly, go ahead and share the website for it. So the website for Knockout, if you guys have never seen it, is knockoutjs.com, and so the license is up here if you're into that. If you need to check that out, it's the MIT license. You can click here to go download it. I'm probably sure somewhere up here is the link off to the GitHub repository, somewhere here, if you're interested in checking out the actual repository. The tutorials and the documentation is really good. You guys probably could read through this in like half a day or a day to really get your head wrapped around it. But obviously, it's the point of this webinar is to go over the basics of Knockout and cover kind of what it's all about and give you guys a jump start to start using Knockout. So what we're going to do is talk about Knockout, its sort of role in web development. It is a client-side library, so it is JavaScript, and the idea is that we're going to be building more and more code in the client, in the browser. And so doing that all just by hand without any help or libraries becomes kind of tedious. So that's the point of this Knockout library. This is a JavaScript library that is going to help us build our user interfaces from data, of course. And so to that end, it supports features that are kind of standard features whenever you're building a user interface and you have data that you want to display. So data binding is sort of the first thing that we're going to check out here. So the whole point or one of the points of Knockout is to give you data binding. You've obtained data from somewhere, and then you need to map it to a user interface. The approach that Knockout uses to do data binding is a declarative approach. So again, if you have a complex UI and you want to display data in lots of different locations, especially if it's the same, say, value in several different places, writing all the code to keep that up to date in the UI can be kind of tedious. So this is a nice declarative model for that. It really saves us a lot of headaches. So to do that, we're going to see a piece of the Pullman called observables, and the whole intent here with observables is that when your data does change, the UI then will automatically get re-data bound, if you will, or update basically to reflect the data that you're working with. Okay, so we'll look at that, and then the mechanism by which it does that is with these things called bindings. We'll see how those work, and then at the end we'll talk about something called JSON, which is basically then we're talking about displaying data in our screen, but of course that data's got to come from somewhere, typically in a browser-based app that is going to come from your server from some sort of AJAX call. So we'll look at then how to take this stuff that's in the UI and then map it to JSON for the purpose of sending back to your backend server. Okay? All right. So again, the motivation here for Knockout, I kind of got into this a little bit, is we have these complex UIs that we want to build in the browser. More and more development seems to be done in the browser these days, as opposed to server side, which is sort of the traditional space of ASP.NET web forms, and also MVC to a certain extent. MVC is very heavy on the server, and so with the movement in web development, given the capabilities of browsers and even mobile browsers on mobile devices, we're finding that people are building more and more apps client side, more and more logic, and more offloading of the of effort is done now in the client off of the server. So JavaScript is the environment we do this in, and doing that in code, becomes complex. That's the way we have historically had all these frameworks on the server to do things like data binding. Or even a desktop application with things like XAML, right? We have a data binding model there as well, and it offloads a lot of the tedious sort of development from the user, from the developer building these UIs. Also, part of the motivation here for this style that Knockout's going to provide us with is helping us do unit testing of your UI, and I'll show you what how that's achieved here in a second. So the pattern with Knockout is this: Knockout is inspired by the MVVM style of data binding, if you will. And the MVVM style was originally developed in the world of Silverlight and WPF. And the idea there is that, actually let me blank out my screen and draw a picture. So the idea is this, is that you have some sort of UI, okay? And so that's going to be called your view, of course. That's the presentation layer, if you will. And historically, at least when I built web apps, if I have my view and I have some data, so say I have some sort of objects floating around over here, and I would always write the code to then take the properties of this object and go map them into the view. So maybe they're text boxes, maybe they're labels, spans, whatever. Okay? And so what I end up doing is writing all the code to tediously grab each individual property and go put them into wherever they need to go in the UI. Okay? So that's okay. It works. We can use things like jQuery to help make this easier. And we've been doing this for a long time. But the problem is this: once your views start to become more and more complex, maybe you're showing the same value X in multiple locations. Maybe you show it in a text box up here, and then you show it somewhere else as a label down here. So the problem with this is that if you start to do updates to this value, say you go in and you change this in the UI, the problem is this guy over here is sort of a duplicate value. It does not automatically get updated. So this whole MVVM pattern is sort of a change in thinking about how to build your UIs. Instead of having your user interface objects and components being the actual source of the data. So in other words, I'm thinking about this text box. That's the actual thing that represents the actual value. Instead, we start to make this thing down here on the right, this object, sort of our source of our data. And what we do is we change our thinking in that the UI is actually derived from this object. Okay, and this is following the MVVM pattern. So what we do is this object down here, we typically call it a view model. Okay, oops, not enough space. So this view model is going to be our data for our UI. Okay, if you guys have ever done MVC, then this is also a very big pattern in MVC, and even in a sense MFC from way back when also kind of has this pattern. So the idea is that we're going to separate out the data that we need to display and also the logic for the display, and we're going to put it into this just simple object with simple code called a view model. And what we do then is we have then the UI, like I said, is sort of derived from the view model. And this is where Knockout comes in. Knockout is going to be the library that takes the data from the view model and then maps it into the view. Okay, that's kind of with the data binding piece here. So that's one sort of piece of the motivation here, is that we're separating out the display of the data from the actual logic around the state of the data. Kind of related to this as well, and what I mean by the state of the data is that let's say you have this text box up here where we're showing X, and then you have some other checkbox somewhere, right? And again, this is all very abstract, obviously, but so let's say your value of your X has to be, like 5 characters long before this checkbox can even be checked, okay? So without a designated place to do that, if you were just coding up the UI directly, you would have to write the code to handle the change events for the text box and then if the, check the text, and if it's greater than the 5 characters, then you would have to go write the code to enable and disable the checkbox. Whatever your complex UI logic may be. Again, writing all that code tightly bound with the UI components and their change events and their whole eventing architecture is kind of messy. So that's what the purpose of this view model is. It's not just a bag of data, but it also is going to have your logic for the state of the UI. So this checkbox, not only is your view model going to have the value for X, but it's also going to have some Boolean that represents whether or not that checkbox should be enabled or not. Okay? And so again, the idea is that you push all of that logic into the view model based on just your data. So your view model will hold X, and then it will hold this, checkbox enabled. And again, forgive my messy drawing here. And so you have some other Boolean here that is, sort of derived from the value X. Okay? The nice thing about this is all of your logic is in code, and you're not actually wound up with the UI and the events off of the UI. Okay? This makes this code testable. You can actually write unit tests totally on this view model without, having anything to do with any HTML elements or their events. All right? So that's another kind of piece of the model here, is that this view model pattern is that it's the source of your data, and the view then is simply a side effect, if you will. All right? Now, of course, at some point you have to tie into the UI, because if the user is, in fact, updating this value of X, we need the value of X to actually be reflected back here in the view model. So that's the other thing with Knockout, is it does two-way data binding. So once the value changes, Knockout is observing the change events, and then it will push the value back here into the view model. Right. The other thing with that then is, again, we talked about the changing this checkbox here. If it must be enabled or disabled based on the value of X, then how on earth does this checkbox in the UI somehow get tied to the value of X back here on this view model? And same thing with actually this little piece over here. This little X label was supposed to be a copy of the value of X from the text box. So that's the other big piece here of Knockout, is that whenever data on your view model changes, your view model is actually going to raise events back to Knockout. So just like the text box up here can raise events to let Knockout know when the value's changed, your view model is going to do the same thing. Okay, so that's the observables piece. If you guys saw there on the initial slide, we had the list of things we're going to talk about. These observables are how Knockout knows that the data in your view model has changed, so that it can actually update them in the UI. So that's enough high-level pictures. There's one more piece of the MVVM model here. So again, this is patterned after MVVM, if I can spell it right. So we talked about the view model. That's this piece here. We talked about the view, which is this piece up here. And then we also have this concept of the model, which we don't really have much prescription, if you will, of the actual model in Knockout or really many of the other frameworks. But the idea is that the model is the original source of the data. So this might be your back-end server with whatever back-end database, or maybe it's a web service, or maybe it's all of your business layer, wherever this comes from. Okay, so the idea is that the model is your like perhaps persistence mechanism, wherever that really comes from. So your model is going to basically influence the view model. Typically, the reason we separate these out is the model, at least in the web world, the model is going to be on your server, the view model is in your JavaScript, but also just in terms of the general pattern of MVVM, is that a lot of times the model, if that is your business layer, the actual data structures and the organization of the data isn't necessarily well suited for presentation purposes up here in the view. So this view model kind of acts as an intermediary, which does transformation of the data into a little bit more of a rendering-friendly format, if you will. Okay. So anyway, as far as Knockout is concerned, this back-end model piece is kind of up for you to decide, because that's your, whatever you're going to do on your back-end server. But the last piece of the talk here today, I will talk briefly about kind of going back and forth between the model and the view model, and then the view model back to your server, and that's where the JSON piece comes in to Knockout. Okay, so anyway, that's the 50,000-foot view of MVVM and kind of what Knockout is going to do. Knockout mainly is concerned with these two layers up here. You're going to be developing this thing called a view model. You're going to be creating, state on the view model and maybe even logic, and that is going to then influence the view. Okay, so I'm going to hop into a demo here on how to do that. We have a couple questions here. Nope, no questions. Okay, good. So I'll just go and start cruising into code. I like to demo mostly, so I'm not big on slides. All right, so I'm going to kick off Visual Studio here, and I'm going to go do a new project, and I'm going to do a web project. And since this is all mainly client-side JavaScript, it doesn't matter if you're using web forms or MVC or whatever, so I'll just actually just do an empty web app. Knockout demo, like this. And I'm going to put simply a HTML page in here. So I'll just do a simple HTML page, and this is going to be my page for Knockout. Okay, so Knockout, I need to include the JavaScript library for Knockout. We can grab that off of NuGet. You can go to the Knockout website. You know, lots of different ways you can get this. Like I said, I'll just grab this off here of NuGet. So I'm going to go Knockout. So there's Knockout.js right there, Steve Sanderson. Yeah. And apparently they're 2.2.1 right now. The other thing I'm going to grab, which is going to come up at the end when we start to do our JSON-related stuff, I'm going to grab this mapping library. This is actually an additional library. Same group of people work on it. So I'm going to grab this as well. Initially, my demos, I'm not going to be using it, but once we, at the end, though, once I start to show it to you, I'll point out that we're using this additional library as well. Okay. So Knockout itself is about 40. Let's see. Actually, let's see how big this is on disk. So there's 40K of disk space, and then the mapping layer is another 10, and that's I don't think that's let's actually go take a look. This is probably minified already. Yeah, this is already minified, but not compressed. So 40K is not so big, and then this additional library, and that's why they don't include it by default. It's another 10K. Not that that's huge, but if you're not using it, then why throw that in there? Okay, so what we're going to do is I'll pull in Knockout. So let me go ahead and grab this. I'll just grab it as a script tag, okay, and then I'll go write my script after this. Notice I'm not using anything like jQuery. Knockout has no dependencies on jQuery. It's just its own standalone little library. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first create my model. So this is going to be some object I create. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it, you know, person, or VM is a common thing for like view model. And you're just going to create an object in JavaScript, okay? So this object is going to have some properties, right? There's my name, and here's my age, okay? And the idea is that I have this object in JavaScript that I want to display in the UI. So to display it in the UI, I'll go create some elements here in the UI. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create elements here that are going to be intended to map to these various properties of my model, okay? So the idea here is I'll put my name, and I'll put in my age, and I want these span elements to be mapped to this these properties. So the way we do this in Knockout is on the elements that you want to bind to, you use a data-bind directive, and this instructs the Knockout library that you want to bind properties of this span to properties of the view model. And the syntax inside a data bind is you list the property of the element, a colon, and then the property of your view model that you want to bind to. Okay, so this is saying I want the text of the span to be bound to the name of the view model. So we'll do that here for our two elements. Same thing here. This will be age. Okay, so that's the declarative piece in Knockout. Here's my data. The last thing I need to do then is bring them together. Okay, so Knockout has this global variable called KO, and I call apply bindings. And what you do is you pass in your view model like that, and it takes this view model. And then it scans the entire document for these data bind directives and applies the binding as we've indicated here declaratively. Okay, so I'll just run this real quick, and we should magically see name and age show up here in my screen. There we go. Awesome. Okay, so that's basically real simple basics of getting some elements bound to some data on your view model. Okay, a very common question that comes up at this point is, well, what if I have multiple view models or maybe different sections of the page that I want different models to be bound to? That's totally fine. Typically what you do is you put some sort of containing element around the section of your page. You give it some sort of ID. Maybe this is my person that I'm displaying. And then what I'll do is when I do apply bindings, as the second parameter here, I actually pass in this element. So I will do a document.get element by ID on person, which is the ID up here. Okay, And so now if you had multiple view models and you wanted to render different view models in different sections of your page, this is how you scope the binding that's occurring. Okay? So I'll go ahead and hit refresh. That should still work. Good. All right. All right. No questions so far? Good. All right. So let me move along here and talk about the two-way data binding aspects. So we can bind these things to input elements as well, and then have the user update these things. So I'll switch this over. I'll put in an input element. And for input elements, we don't bind the text property. There is no text property of input elements. Text is basically the contents of an element. Input elements, as you can see here, actually, strictly speaking, they don't have any children. They don't have any contents. So they don't have a text property. What they have, if you actually were to code this right here, they have a value property. So that's what I want to bind. I want the value property to be bound. So there is, instead of text, there's the keyword value. And what I can do then is now name will be bound to both the span and that input element. Okay? So if I go back to my browser, hit refresh, magic, right? Populates both the span and the input element with my data. Now the next thing about this, though, of course, is, okay, well, what about this whole update thing? That's part of what Knockout has. Is it has data binding. As we can see, we're binding the UI to our data, but it also supports two-way data binding. So as you change the values of this text box, okay, and when you tab out, that will trigger the change event. Okay? When Knockout does a binding to value, it then handles the change event, and what happens is when that element raises the change event, it will grab the current value and it pushes it back in to the original view model. So there's like a two-way link between these two. So this really worked. Okay? If I hit F12 in my developer tools, and we go look here in the console window, and I go to my VM object, right, that's just a global, and I print out the name, right, you guys can see that it has in fact been updated live. Okay? So the view model has actually been updated, right? So the two-way data binding mapped the value back. Okay? So that's Knockout's two-way data binding support. Works, you know, out of the box. That's just how it works. Okay? Now, of course, everybody's looking at this thing up here saying, whoa, wait a minute, that didn't get updated. Okay? So I've shown you data binding and two-way data binding, okay? But the problem now is, well, the UI up here, the span, it only knew to bind the value once, and it didn't know that the name actually had changed. Okay? And the reason that it didn't know that is because nothing on the view model raised a notification to tell anybody that the name changed. Okay, and this is, you know, just how JavaScript works, right? These are just simple strings, and there's no built-in, you know, change notification just on simple strings and numbers and whatnot in JavaScript. So you have to build that in. Okay, and so Knockout came up with their own approach for doing that. This is the same problem for .NET or Java or anything else, to be honest. And so in Silverlight and WPF, they had to solve the same problem. And so in those environments, so that the UI bindings could automatically update, what they did is in Silverlight and WPF, your class, your view model object, has to implement an interface. And I think it's called something like I can never remember, data notify changed or something like that. I don't do Silverlight and WPF, so I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. But it's something like I notify property change. I think that's actually it. So it's I notify property change. That sounds, that's definitely ringing a bell. So the problem is, you know, they had to come up with some mechanism, and so they did it with this interface-based approach off the class. Well, in JavaScript, we don't really have classes per se. So we don't really have interfaces per se, and nor do we have a mechanism for this to implement an interface. So the approach in Knockout is, instead of having the entire object raise change notifications, they have the individual properties raise change notifications. So the way this works is, instead of your property being just a simple string, what we need to do is somehow make this into an object that will raise change events. And that object then will encapsulate the actual value of the string, or the number, or whatever it's going to be. So the way Knockout approaches this is that it turns your string properties, or just your regular properties, into things called observables. And so what you have to do is sort of wrap up the value with this thing called an observable. Okay, and what that does then is it makes now these properties on your view model, it makes these properties now an object, okay, not just the simple primitive type. Okay, this object then, when the value changes, it will raise a notification. Okay, so it automatically has a notification or change notification support, and the data bindings up here then automatically register for them. And so then, as this text box pushes the value into the observable then will raise its change event, and then the span up here will go ahead and register, have registered for that, and update its value accordingly. Okay, so if I go back to my browser here, hit refresh. Okay, now change my value to Brock Allen. I tab out, and notice it immediately updates. Okay, so the change notification, by the way, is occurring on change of the text box. That occurs when it loses focus. If you want it to be faster than that, then there's a value update property that you can specify here, and we're going to do key up. And what will happen then is on every key up, it will change the text box value. So now if I hit refresh, notice as I do Allen like this, as I type, it's changing it 4, 5, 6 times as I hit the key, and then my corresponding label up here is going to be updated. All right, so I think there's a question. Let me go look over here real quick. All right, so how would Knockout differentiate between two view models that both have a field called name? Again, that's I think your question relates to the thing I did earlier here, where I had to you can't have two properties called name on the view model. So you would need two different view models if they had separate names, and then you would have to then divvy up your UI somehow and call apply bindings twice for those two different view models. I think that's what you're looking for. Okay. So like I showed earlier, when you apply bindings, you can basically set the container of the bindings. So if you had name from two different view models in two different parts of your UI, you would have to somehow differentiate it with this ID. Okay. Or you have an aggregate object and you somehow name them differently, right? That would be another approach. Okay, so hopefully that answered your question. Let's see, what's next here? Oh, so getting back to these observables. So one thing about the observables to understand is that now your view model no longer has these primitive properties. Instead, you have these objects which are your properties. And so it turns out then, if you want to ever read or write the values of your view model, you can't just do name equals, Joe anymore. You can't just assign to that, because you're going to lose this little intermediary observable object. So instead, the way you read or write the values that are being contained by the observable is that you invoke these. Okay? So what will happen is you invoke name, passing in the parameter that you would like to assign it to. And similarly then, if you want to read the value, you have to invoke it, but in this case you don't pass anything, and this will tell the observable object that you would like to read the value. Okay? So this is how you would write the value, and then this is how you would read the value. So var, the name equals that, something like that. Okay? All right. So actually, let's go do something like this. Let's actually go put a button in here that allows you to change these values. So right now we can change the name by typing in a new name. Let's change the age by clicking the button. Okay, so let's say the button is a get older button. Okay, and what I'm going to do is whenever you click it, I'm going to invoke a function on the view model, and the view model will bump up the age by 1. Okay, so we can do bindings not only to values like we did for name and text. I'm sorry, for text and value up here. We can also do bindings to events like this. Okay, so what I can do is I can bind the click of the button to a get older function on the view model. So what I'll do is I'll go define a get older function on the view model, and the purpose of get older is to bump up your age. So what I'm going to do is I will do vm.age to access the age. Okay, I'll add 1 to it, and then I will assign it back by invoking the vm.age again. Okay, so just in one line of code. All right, so this will show a few things. One is that we have bindings to events. This should invoke our getOlder. And then given the syntax here, this should illustrate that the property syntax actually works to read and write the values. So if we go back over here, okay, run this again, and now as I click my button, changes that. And as I change the text box, it changes that. Okay, awesome. Okay, so I think I answered that one. Actually, let me remove all these things. Demo folder, thanks, hi Brock. There's John. Okay, so how would you use jQuery to select the div? Well, if you're using jQuery to select this, so to scope the binding, I think is what you're asking, you would use jQuery to find this thing. Okay, so that's that. So the thing is, though, with jQuery, what's happening is jQuery then is giving you a jQuery object on top of this. So what you really want is the actual DOM element beneath it. So you could just reach in and grab the 0th element in the wrapped collection, and that would give you access to it. I've never tried. I mean, I don't have jQuery in here. We could try it. I don't know if apply bindings is smart enough if you passed in the actual jQuery object, if it would then know how to, you know, dereference it and get actually to the actual element. I've never tried that before. I usually just, I know what it takes as an element, so I usually just do that syntax if I'm using jQuery. But if you're doing an ID and you need to go find it, you know, to begin with, then you might as well just use document.getElement by ID, because that's all jQuery is actually using. Okay. Anyway, that would definitely work though. It's just that I've never tried it without the subscript there. So, all right, you know, hey, go try it and shoot me an email. Let me know if it works. All right. Okay, who's next? Is the name field change occurring in the database? No, this is not occurring in the database. This is all client-side in JavaScript. This is not hitting the network. This has no connection back to the server. Okay, this is all just objects that you're using in JavaScript in the browser to model the data you want to display in this UI. Okay, well, I'll talk a little bit about at the end how to then take the data and move it back and forth to the server. Okay. So how's the data bind different from onClick equals vm.getOlder? So the data bind is different because we are using, obviously, knockouts mechanism. I suppose you could put onClick equals vm.getOlder. Let me think about that a little bit. So first of all, this would have to have access to VM. That's assuming, here it's global, right? I've never tried to do something like that. Also, and this is just stylistically independent of independent of knockout. In general, the inline onClick style of handling events tends to not be preferred, especially because if you want to handle multiple multiple listeners for the one click, this tends to only be able to support the one. So registering for events programmatically tends to be the preferred method for doing that. And so when you use knockout to do that, they're definitely using the programmatic approach. So if you had some other piece of code in the page, totally unrelated to this knockout stuff, you could have it register then for the click event as well, and both could get the click notifications. Okay. Just for giggles, I'll put that in here real quick, which is always very dangerous to do. What are we doing? getOlder like this. Okay. I could give that a shot and see what happens. Okay. Hey, look at that. Awesome. Okay. So it does in fact have access to the VM, and then we're invoking, getOlder. So if that does work, again though, this is only going to have one onClick listener. So, all right. Cool. All right. One more question, then I'm going to continue on here. Is it good from an architectural perspective to make knockout two-way data bind to the database and to the client? Well, right. Again, typically what you have in your UI is like a snapshot of your data. You work with that locally in memory, and then once you're ready to change, you then hit some button and it pushes it back to the server. Again, like an AJAX call. So you would probably be going through like a web API layer of some sort of AJAX layer to get back to your server. All right, how do user controls? This has nothing to do with user controls. This is purely client side. So if your user's controls render markup, it's going to be like this. So in terms of how this relates to user controls, it doesn't really. User controls render markup, and then you can do this after the fact. This is all client side. User controls are server. And two different functions in the data bind. I've never tried two different functions in here. Click. I wonder if I could call two. Let's try it twice. Okay, something like that. Like if I had to get older two. Okay, so if this actually works, then that means I'm guessing this is going to get called twice. Nope, apparently not. And I don't have any errors here, so it didn't mind the syntax. Okay. But if you had other events, like I'm trying to think what other event they have here. To know what the bindings are, you can go check out the documentation like I showed you earlier. And so if you look here, the bindings we're doing like click, right? Click is like a specific binding. I don't see any other ones like mouse over, mouse out, that kind of thing. You can always use the event binding though. So you could always do event like this. Okay, and then you would do click, get older, something like that. That's how you could then register for like other events. So like, mouse over, I don't know, whatever method you would have called foo. So this is to be the syntax if you wanted to register for different types of events. Okay, I don't know if you can register click twice here though. Again, I'll try it just for giggles to see what happens and see if it's smart enough to handle this. Where did my other browser go? No, I think what it's doing is it's seeing that you already have the one and it's only allowing that in. So. But anyway, if you had other events like mouse over, mouse out, whatever you wanted to do, this syntax could also work. Okay. All right. So let's move on. I got some more stuff to cover here. Okay. So another thing with Knockout is a lot of times you have data that you want to display that is actually like a calculated value. So not the actual literal value. It's like a calculated value that's typically calculated from your current state. So let's do this. Imagine what I want is I want a description of the person. If I can spell that right. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do data bind the text to some property called description. Okay? And so description then is going to be both my name and my age put together. So that is not a property I have here. Instead, I want it to be, combined from name and age. So what we can do is we can put a description property here that is a function that, combines these two values. The thing, though, is that this description, since it depends on name and age, I need it to have that same sort of update capability so that when name or age changes, the description also changes or is updated in the UI. So Knockout, to accommodate this sort of scenario, has what's called a computed value. So it's a function that you write that is, in fact, computed from the other properties of your view model. And so what I'll do then is I will just return my view model, the name value, and again, notice I have to invoke this to get the value, and I can put is plus vm.age plus, years old or something like that, okay? So this is a property that's a calculated value from other properties, okay? And by wrapping it in the KO computed little helper here, then Knockout will do change tracking. It knows that description is derived from these two other properties. So if I refresh this, if I change my name to B. Brock Allen, notice this changes here, and then if I bump my age, this also changes, okay? So this computed thing is quite handy. All right, let me talk about a few other types of bindings that are quite nifty. We can bind other things other than text, other than value, other than click. Okay, like I said, text, value, and click are sort of a few of the hard-coded bindings in Knockout. And like I showed over here on the documentation page, they show some of the other bindings that we have. So you can bind text and HTML and some CSS classes and CSS styles. Also things like enable and disabling elements. You can enable and disable elements based on state as well. Okay? So let me show you a couple of those. Let me first do a style-related property. So what I want is I want the name of the person to change CSS classes based on state on my object. So let's just do this. Let's just do color is, red. I can't spell, C-O-L-O-R. Okay, so I want the color to be, or rather, let me phrase it this way. I want this CSS class to be applied to this element when the person is over a certain age. Okay? Now, the person being over a certain age, that's logic. And so remember, the whole point of this approach was that I could put all of my logic into my view model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another computed function called isOld. Okay. And isOld is going to say, it's going to return true if the age is greater than, say, 45. Okay? So I'll start at 40, I won't be technically old, and then I'll click the button a few times, and then I will hit this threshold. Okay? So it's going to be false until I hit that, that particular age. So what I want to do is I want the color of, the text box to be nothing special, but then when it hits the age, the old to true, I want to apply the CSS class. Okay? So that is the CSS binding. And the CSS binding, the syntax, is actually similar to the event syntax I showed down here. What you do is you set up kind of this complex thing with the curly braces, and then you say the old colon is old. And the way to read this is you are setting a CSS class. The name of the class is old, which is what I did up here, okay? And it is to be there, it is to be added to the span when isOld is true, and it is to be removed when isOld is false. Okay? All right. So let's do this. Let's run this. Okay? Initially, not, just have no CSS class. Actually, if we inspect the element even, and go look here on the element, notice there's no CSS class called old. Okay? All right. So now what I do is I hit the button a few times. Okay, and there we go. And now the class was added of old. Okay, why nothing changed? What did I screw up? Old color red. Let's do. Oh, sorry, I put it in quotes. That's why. Silly me. Okay, let's hit refresh here one more time. There we go. Okay, silly CSS mistake. All right, cool. So see what happened there is that we added the class once we hit 45. Okay, and then if you have other logic for whatever reason, maybe you have to be greater than 45 but less than, say, 50. Okay, so you're old between 45 and 50. So once we hit 51, I guess, then it should be taken away. So 45, 51, they got taken away. Okay? All right, there we go. Pretty cool. So nice logic here. It's centralized on the view model, not buried in some sort of UI code that is hard to test. Okay? That's the intent of this stuff. All right, so we can do CSS this way. We can also do styles like, let's do this. Let's data bind other stuff. Instead of the class, let's data bind the color right in line. Okay, so this is sort of a variation on doing the class-based styling. We can do this data bind, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a style directive instead. Okay, so the way style works is you actually put in the value. So same thing. We're going to do color here. That's the actual style property you want to bind. And the color is going to be, well, this doesn't make any sense, but we'll do it from the name. Okay? So this will actually bind to the name property. So what's going to happen here is if I happen to call myself blue, okay, notice the entire thing up here then turned blue. Okay? So you can bind individual style properties if you really need to, but again, I would prefer to see CSS classes. Here's the last thing we can do. We can do arbitrary attributes. Okay, so let's do arbitrary attributes. Let's do, I guess we'll do it right here. This is a very another common one to do, adder. Same thing. You can bind these things. So adder, which attribute do you want to bind? Well, you have to put it in this curly braces, and we'll do the title. And maybe the title is bound from the description. That seems to make sense. like this. Okay, and so you can do attributes, any other attribute that you want. Okay, so we'll do that. Hit refresh. Notice as I hover over the name, it says Barack is 40. I don't know if you guys can see that right here. You can see it down here, though, in the actual element in the markup, though. Barack is 40 years old. Okay. As I change the value, bump it up, change it to Barack Allen, whatever, the tooltip shows Barack is 47, and it is, in fact, changed down here. Okay. One more thing about attribute bindings, or just bindings in general, is that these are just binding directly to the value. You can also put expressions in here. Okay. So what you can do is, the name is a little funny for style. Just putting the name, if I change this to be blue or whatever, right, that didn't really make a lot of sense. But what you can do is you can put that logic for the age. Okay? So what we want here is we'll do that same logic where the color needs to be blue if the age is greater than, say, 45 or 50. So what you can do is you can do an expression in here, right? So you can do age. Okay? Now when you access age in an expression, let's do greater than or equal to 50. Right, then I want the value to be, let's do red, otherwise I want it to be green, say. Okay? If you're going to do an expression like this here, I need to use single quotes, by the way. Right, inside of these data bind directives, you always need to, if you're going to do strings, you always need to do single quotes. So here, this is this expression. That's kind of intuitively what you would want to do. But remember what I said earlier about age. When you access it, you have to use the invocation syntax. So same thing with these expressions. You have to actually invoke age to get the value for your expression up here. So what's going to happen is initially this should be green, and then my logic should kick in once it goes over 50. I think 50 is what I put it to be. Yeah, there we go. Notice that turned red. Okay. All right. Maybe orange. Just make it look different. So it's green, and then ultimately it turns orange. Okay, awesome. Okay, so anyway, you guys get the idea there. Let me check the questions real quick, and then we'll then I still have to show you still more with collections. Again, objects bound to ASP.NET controls. This is all client side. This has nothing to do with server side. So again, this is where you are not using server-side controls, or if you are using server-side controls, you're not binding on the server. This is really pushing the logic to the client side. You are doing less on the server and more on the client. That's the whole intent of this framework. Okay. What events is Knockout listening to for computed fields? Just the two observables. What events is Knockout listening to for computed fields? I'm not sure what you mean there, Rafi. You mean, so for this computed, this description up here, what event is it listening to? What it's listening to is the change event that the observable itself raises. So actually, as an example there, you can actually do this yourself. You can register, and I gotta remember the name, subscribe, there we go. So you can actually walk up to this observable and subscribe yourself to the change notification. And that's internally all Knockout is doing, is when it says, oh, I'm going to bind this to an observable, what I do is I register to the subscribe event. And that's the event that the observable raises to update whoever wants to know, whether it be the binding in the UI or some custom code here. So anyway, that's the actual event. They have their own subscribe event. How does it determine which observables to hook into? So the way it determines which observables is via the property binding here. So you're saying whatever expression you're using here, like text is bound to description, that's the property, that's the observable. How can we bind actions the same way we bind CSS, like we bind a click event? I think for an action, if you want to bind an action based on state, you would do that check inside of the button. So in other words, in the get older, you would need to do your whatever logic you're talking about down here. The actual registration itself for events, I don't think you can conditionally do that. I've never tried, so that doesn't mean there's not a way to do it, but given my experience with Knockout, that doesn't really seem like its style. Okay, so you would always bind the event, and then if you have any conditional logic, you would actually run that in the event handler itself. Had the description function node only listen for events raised by name and age? Good question. So what happens is when they when you set up a computed, what it actually does is it actually, as the function here is being invoked, they then keep a internal track of which other properties you access. It's pretty clever how they do it. So that's how they do it. They do change tracking based on the behavior of the function itself. So there are some good blog posts from Steve Sanderson about the internals of this. You should check them out on his blog. Okay, cool. So I have a couple more things to show you, and then I would like to wrap up soon. So the next thing we have is the support for collections, and that really is kind of what helps round off Knockout. So imagine I have some children. All right, so I have a couple of kids, right? And so I will have arrays here. So I have 2 daughters, Mira and Tess. Okay, so these are my kids. So what I'm going to do is I want to show them also in the UI. So what I'm going to do is use another binding in Knockout. So I have a UL, and I want to bind an entry in the UL for each one of my children. So what I'm going to use here is I'm going to use a binding, which is called the for each binding. Okay? And what happens is with the for each binding is the for each works with these items, and it iterates over each item that we have here, and it then the contents of this UL become basically a template that gets executed for each item in the collection or each item in the array. Okay? So what we end up doing then is the object that you're binding to now changes. Up here, the object that we were binding to was the top level view model. But now the object that we're binding to inside of the UL is going to actually be these individual strings. Okay? So just to show you that we in fact have a kid, and it will run for however many children we have, I will put just a UL with static content. And if I hit refresh over here, notice we ended up getting this twice. Okay? So the thing we want to do then is now actually display data for the item that is that we're binding to. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do data bind. Okay? Same as I did before, but again, you got to keep in mind the context has changed. Right? The context is no longer the top level view model, it's now the actual item in the array. Now, normally we would have bound, like text is bound to the name property. And again, it would have been the name property of whatever object we have here. The thing is that we don't have an object, we have a string. So we don't have a name property on the string. So in this particular scenario, I want to bind to the string itself. So Knockout has a few little macros, if you will, that map to the actual context going on here. So one of them is $data. So $data indicates that this is the actual value itself. Similarly, like up here, we could have done $data, oops, okay, and that would have been the entire object itself. But since we're binding to an object that had properties, well, then you can just shortcut this by doing just name. But if you really wanted to, I could have up here done $data, which is the whole view model, and then accessed its name property. Okay? So here, in this context, we're binding to an array of strings. We don't have an object, we just have the string. I'll just use $data. So if I go back, hit refresh, I get the appropriate names. Okay? If, in fact, this were an object, like this, and it had a property called name, then just like we showed earlier, then I would have done $name or just name. Again, you got to realize you're binding now, though, to a different object. You're binding to the child object, not the top-level view model object. Okay? So refreshing here, this still does the same thing. Okay? All right, let's pop in our text boxes, of course. We want to be able to change their names. So I'll just copy the text box from up here and pop it in here like this. Okay? That was weird. Okay, so hit refresh here. Now there's the name. Okay, so I can change this, of course. Mira Allen, and what happened? Well, the problem here is that vm.kids of 0. Notice the value did in fact get changed. It did change to Mira Allen, but the problem here is that the label over here, the span, did not get updated. And again, the fundamental problem here is that the value we're binding to is not observable. We were able to two-way data bind it, but the other part of the UI did not get updated. So, same as the name up here is observable. If you're having children object, then those properties also need to be observable. Okay. So all of the different objects in your hierarchy tend to have lots of observable properties. Okay. So now I hit refresh, and now as I change this, we see that the names in fact change. Awesome. All right, let's do this. How about we show the number of children? Let's do that in my description. Okay, let's see if this works. Yeah, cool. Right now I have 2 kids. Okay, so that works. That's awesome. Let's click my when I click my button. Let's put in another kid here as well. Make this a little bit more dynamic. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is when I click my button, where did my button go? Here, it's get older function. I will do vm.kids.push. Okay. I will add a new object into the collection. Okay. I need to put in some new name here, like new name, whatever. And the same thing. This object needs to be observable, or rather the properties do, just like everything else. So I'll pop that in there, new. Okay. All right. So hit refresh. Okay, get older, and weird. We're getting some odd behavior. Let's hit refresh here. So it's weird. It didn't update to 3, but now it did 1 later. There's some odd behavior going on here. Okay, so the fundamental problem, and then obviously it's not showing up down here in my list. So the fundamental problem here is that my bindings and whatnot. Did I do this in the right order, right? Push. Yeah, I did. So the fundamental problem here is that, oh, I see what's happening. The age changed, which triggered the description to change, and at that point in time, I only had that many kids, okay? So it's a little weird. It's not quite in sync, all right? So the fundamental problem is this. I still have a bug. The problem is this, is that the array itself, the plumbing doesn't know when the array changes. Okay, I was just sort of accidentally getting this number updated because the age field was changing as well and causing the description to get updated. So things aren't quite lined up. And again, like I said, the problem is this actual collection itself is not observable. So guess what they have in Knockout? The concept of observable arrays. That means that you can have collections where anytime the collection changes, meaning things are added or removed, then anything that is associated or anything bound to the array will know that it needs to get updated. So my for each will know to get updated, okay? And then so will my count. Well, if I were to say, let's actually do the kid count directly, right? Something like this, right? We can do kids.length, okay? So the thing is, though, again, now kids here is a observable object, not an array. So we need to invoke it as an array, invoke the observable to get the array so we can get the length. And then same thing down here when we are getting the count. Okay? We need to invoke it as a function to return the actual underlying collection and get that count. Okay? So with that little modification, I think our array business is going to start to work better. So if I add new kids, awesome. Our numbers here keep in sync, and now my collection here is in fact, right, new Alan 1 and new 2 Alan or whatever, kid, Joe or whatever. All right, you get the idea. Okay. So that is working with collections. We have the notion of an observable array. Okay, and the last thing I want to do is show you then getting rid of items in the collection. Okay, so what I'm going to do for that is in the actual collection, right, I'm going to have some remove button. Okay, so maybe the kid goes off to college, say. That's at least what I want to pretend here. Okay, so what we're going to do is when you click, what's going to happen is I need a function to be invoked to remove the child that we're on from the collection. Okay. Now, normally when you do data binding, your declarative bindings here, the thing you're binding to, right, is the current item. So if we were to have, some function called remove kid, then this function would have to be on the individual child objects. Okay, so in this case, that doesn't really make a lot of sense because the individual child objects don't own the collection; they're in the collection. So we have another little kind of macro in here. What I want to do is I want to invoke a remove kid on the parent object. So I want this remove kid function to be on this top level view model, not on the individual children. Okay, so I'm going to do remove kid equals a function. And the whole point of this function is to remove the kid that we're clicking the button for. So now the question becomes, which kid do we want to remove? So it turns out that anytime you bind event handlers in Knockout to some sort of function, the first parameter to the function is the data item that was being bound. So it'll be that dollar data parameter or value, which will be the actual kid in this context. So fortunately now, vm.kids.remove the kid. Okay, remove is not normally a function on arrays in JavaScript, but the observable array provides a remove function. And they go through and they find the actual matching entry and they remove it from the collection. Removing it from the collection then obviously triggers a change on the entire collection, which means our count should get updated, as should the actual collection. Okay. So now let's make it a little smaller here. So we add a few more kids. My kid count goes up, and then I remove that one and that one and that one. And now these are all being removed properly, from the collection. Okay. All right. So that's basically working with observable arrays. All right. Let me go check the questions here for a minute. So in terms of testing the VM, what I'd recommend is basically looking at how you do unit testing with JavaScript. So there's nothing really special necessarily with testing Knockout versus any other type of code you might test in JavaScript. I think the real topic there, though, is just basically how do you do unit testing in JavaScript. So that is, it's kind of its own big topic. I don't know if you already do unit testing on your .NET code, but if you're already familiar with server-side, your server-side code in terms of unit testing, client-side unit testing is very, very similar. The two big frameworks that I would point you at, one is called QUnit. That is the unit testing framework that was invented by the jQuery team, and they invented this unit testing framework for testing their own platform. And then the other very popular one is called Jasmine. JavaScript unit testing. I'll go search for the right thing to make sure we narrow our search. And yes, I think this is it. Yeah, so this is the Jasmine library for doing unit testing. And they each have their own strengths and weaknesses. I tend to think maybe Jasmine's a little bit nicer as a unit testing framework as well. But anyway, this is just the kind of thing you would do is you write tests, and you have expectations of the tests, and you do your typical setup, and then you do your checking at the end for whatever you expect the state to be. So you could do that then with your observable objects. Okay. Please share the samples. Yep, the samples. I'll give you guys a link at the end. I had it at the beginning, so if you missed that, I'll go ahead and link that again at the end. So how would you bind data without any span or other controls? So if you want to do binding just like inline here, just as text, then there's actually a way to do it in comments, and I don't remember the exact syntax, but it's something like this. I forget the exact syntax. I actually used this just like a week ago myself. You do something like this, and this may or may not be the exact syntax, I forget, but you actually do a comment in the JavaScript, and Knockout, I think there's some flag here like KO to tell Knockout that you want to bind the contents of the section with the name property. Let's just see if that works. I don't remember off the top of my head if that's the exact right syntax, but nope, didn't look like it worked. But it's something like this. I'd have to look it up. Actually, we just had the help up a second ago, but it's something like that, and that's how you can do binding without tags. So I don't want to waste too much time by digging this up if I can't find it right away. But that's something you could go and search for. So it's like comment binding or something like that. Template data binding. They call it comment binding. I can't find it off the, quickly. So anyway, that's definitely possible. It's just like I said, the syntax escapes me right now. But you'd have to go dig that up to get the exact syntax. Sorry, I don't remember it. Right. So again, same answer as many of the other questions is that if the data is coming from the database, how do you do this stuff? Well, this is all purely client side. So this is right now is totally disconnected from the server. In a minute, actually, this is the next topic is then talking about how to merge back with the server. So I'll talk about that in a minute. Does each object have an observable array? So can each object inside the observable array be an observable object? Yes, absolutely. So just like I showed here, these properties themselves can be observable, and then they can have their own observable arrays, and you could recurse from there. Does the change bubble up? I don't think so. So in other words, these are self-contained. You'd have to be bound directly to them. That's a really good question, though. So it's like if something way down in the hierarchy changes and you are observing at the top, can you know if that changed? I don't think so. These only are at the one level. I've never tried to dig into that, but no, given my understanding of Knockout, I've never tried to look. So it doesn't mean something like that couldn't be achieved, but I don't think it supports that out of the box. Integration with jQuery Validate. I've never tried to do integration with jQuery Validate. A friend of mine, actually, we were talking just last week or two about this, and he was saying he does this totally fine with jQuery Validate. So I've never tried, so I don't know if there are any issues to run into, but apparently it's possible. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I don't think that's a problem, because then you would just set up your normal jQuery Validate on the actual elements. It does its own thing. Yeah, I've never tried, but I don't see why that would be a problem. So anyway, give it a shot. If you have a data context object which holds data, and you have VM instantiate its own observable array and updates back the data. I'm not quite sure I follow the question there, Diego. Which loads data. You have each VM instantiate, each view model its own observable array. The master copy, if you will, of the data is the view model, if that makes sense. I guess I'm not quite sure what you're saying. I mean, mapping this then back to your server then is sort of like the next step. So, okay. All right. So let me show that last thing then. So the last thing I just wanted to talk about briefly was so we have been totally disconnected from the server. We have these view models. They map to the UI, and the UI is doing our binding back and forth. At some point, somebody's going to want to say, okay, I'm ready for the data to be sent back to the server. So you hit a button, save, or something, right? Something occurs in the UI that you want to then push the data back to your server. So that's the point at which you are going to take this data, this view model, and you want to send it to your server over an AJAX call. So there are APIs to do that. So normally what you do, I'll just hack this up down here. I'm not even going to put a button click or anything. I just want to talk about mapping it back to JSON. So normally you do JSON.stringify. So this is the built-in function in the DOM or in the browser to take an object and serialize it into JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. And then that JSON you would send as the body of your AJAX call. Okay? So let me show you what happens then when we stringify an observable object. Okay? So I'll just print it, pop it open as an alert dialog here in the screen when our page loads. So I'll go here and refresh. And what we ended up getting was, well, if you guys can see that, that's an empty object in JavaScript. So the problem is this stringify for a view model with observables didn't work. And the reason is the view model doesn't actually have any state. It has a whole bunch of functions hanging off of it. So the stringify method went through and said, hey, are you a primitive? Are you primitive? No, 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 no. Okay, well, I have no data to serialize. It has a bunch of objects. So the problem there is that this object has all these observables sort of obscuring the data that we want to deal with. So Knockout has some functions to convert a view model with all of its observables into a plain JavaScript object. Okay? So what this ko.2js function does is it walks over the view model, removing all of the observables. And then once you've removed all the observables, you have a plain old JavaScript object. This recurses, by the way. So if you have, these observable array, and then it has all these observable properties beneath it, it recurses and recurses and recurses. So that should give us back a clean down object with just data, and then we can stringify that. Okay? So if we hit refresh here, hit OK, and then refresh, notice we actually then got all of our data. Okay? Now we end up getting also those computed values. Okay, so we'll have to figure out how to strip those off if you don't want those, but at least we did convert the observable into a pure JavaScript object so that we can then read the data. There's also a shortcut for this, by the way. There's like a one-liner. So instead of doing the two-step process, you can actually do ko.toJSON like this and pass in the view model directly. And that's basically just these 2 lines of code for you. Okay, so that's like a shortcut to do that. Okay, so then yeah, again at this point though, if you needed to strip off those other observables, the computed things, then you'd have to do that sort of between these 2 steps yourself. Okay, so that's up to you to figure out how to do. A lot of times when people would do something like this, you'd do something like delete JS dot description, whatever things that you don't want to be there on transmission on the network, you could remove them that way. That's the delete operator in JavaScript allows you to do that. Okay. All right. Okay, so that's a couple different ways to do that. Here's the other thing you can do then is, of course, so that is how you prepare your data for transmission to the server. What about getting data from the server? So you have just a plain old JavaScript object. Okay, so var JavaScript. So, or even JSON. So say you get JSON from your server, you need to turn that into an object, and then that object needs to then become observable. So again, there's a JSON.parse. This is built into the browser where you can we'll just take this JSON here. You can parse JSON, right? And that'll give you back then a plain old JavaScript object. The problem here, though, again, is it's just a plain JavaScript object. So imagine this JSON came from your server from an AJAX call. What I'd like to do then is take this JavaScript object and make it observable. So there is no ko.to from JS or from JSON. Okay, so there's no built-in methods that pair with the ones I'm showing you here, the 2JSON and the 2JS. But remember, I mentioned earlier that other library, which I didn't think I included it. Where's my JavaScript? Here it is. So remember, I also mentioned that there's this other library, which is called the mapping library. The mapping library supports that. Okay, so this is if you do want to take JavaScript from your server and convert it automatically into an observable, then that's what the mapping library here is for. At least that's one thing it does. Okay, so what you can do then is you can take your JavaScript object from the server, okay, and you call ko.mapping.fromJS. Allows you to take a simple JavaScript object, and then that'll give you back an observable view model. Or just like the shortcut for the other one, there is a ko.mapping from JSON like this. Okay, and this will go directly from JSON. It'll basically do the parse for you and then call the JS. So right at this point, it takes the JSON, turns it into an object, and then recursively through that object, all the properties all get wrapped up with observables, and any of the properties that are arrays, they then get wrapped up as observable arrays, and it recurses through all the array items. Okay, so I've actually been using this quite a bit in a project that I've been working on recently, where I get the JSON from the server, and it's a nice, easy one-line function to turn JSON into a observable model. The other thing too is that if you, like I did here, so here when I originally created my view model, I had to individually do name and then age as observables. If you're kind of lazy like me, a lot of times what I find myself doing is I just do VM equals, and then I just code this up as a simple, model like this, and then I do VM equals ko.mapping from JS of the view model like this, okay, like that. So that's sort of a lazy person's approach to taking a view model with just simple properties and then getting your whole observable out of it, okay? We'll do name, and then we'll do age, right? That doesn't necessarily solve, well, I guess it does solve your name problems as well. So let me put this, I'll put these all back in real quick. So this should actually just work with one shot here. So I just make this the number, I just make this a regular array, and then I make these normal properties. And if I didn't mess anything up, then this should give us basically the equivalent of what I had here, okay? And then you can add all your additional functionality there. Okay. Let's just see if that still works, if I messed anything up. Nope, I think it worked. So get older, add some kids, Mira Allen, that's still observable, Brock Allen, yeah, that all still works. Okay. All right, now one additional feature here, and let me just see if I can give this a shot here, is ko.mapping.from, to JS of our view model. Okay. And I want to do, oh no, to JSON. That's what I wanted. Okay. Notice the one benefit here, the one subtle change. So what I did here, one last thing about this is, what I did is I used the mapping library to call toJSON instead of the knockout library toJSON. Okay. So this is one last thing that's kind of nice about the mapping layer, is the mapping layer, notice it knows the difference between things that you added before and then the things you added after. So what's nice about this then is that it actually can distinguish between the things that are just pure data and then all the additional stuff that we added later on. So I've been actually, this is what I've been using in the project I've been working on. So now the description and all those other things that I had to say, I said earlier that you would have to have like manually deleted, right? The mapping library already can do that for you. So kind of a nice feature of that. Okay. All right. So anyway, that's how you would map this stuff back to your server. Okay. Again, what we're doing is we're not doing the work on the server, which is traditionally what we would do with web forms and MVC. We are now pushing all of this building of the UI to the client, which really eliminates a lot of the need for your server-side coding. And now you really just need on the server AJAX endpoints that take your data and do your work, whether it's updating the database or calling some other service or whatever. Okay. So this is basically, many of the questions came up. Well, how does this actually merge with my server-side stuff? And basically this approach is mainly through some sort of service invocation. So the UI is distinct from the server. You then do your work with these objects in memory in the client. You save them out onto the network as JSON. You send it to the server, and that's how it gets back to your database. And then same thing from the database out to your UI. The database returns some data. You turn it into JSON on the network, right, via AJAX. And then here in the UI, you take this JSON and bind it into a view model and then update your UI from that. Okay, so I know there are a lot of questions about how does this map back to the server, and that's really the approach. Okay. Okay, thanks, Calvin. Yeah, so we're basically done. So I know I didn't really go through the slides, but there's a lot of reference material in the slides. Let me take the link for the demos again. I'll paste this into the chat window so everybody gets a copy of that, and then I'll answer a few more questions. So again, here are the demos. Again, they're not there yet. I still have yet to zip them up and put them up there, but that's where they will be in the next 15 minutes. If you're using knockout mapping and JS object as property that is an empty array, how will mapping then build for the view model? So let me understand your question the right way. So if you're using the mapping library and the JS object is an empty array, so you can create an observable array on an empty array, because the observable array is just the observable for the array as a whole. It doesn't really care about the entries. It just knows about when items are added or removed and raises its change notification for the collection itself. The individual items then still have to be, having the observable properties that they need. So hopefully that answers your question. I'm still not quite following. So if that didn't answer it, go ahead and ask again, and I'll see if I can help you out. Let me read it again. If you're using mapping property that's an empty array, how will mapping then build a member? Yeah, it doesn't build members of the observable array itself. Right. So right now, let me go change my example here. Then let's change it back to just be the empty array. Okay, so let's take these two kids out. Okay, now it's an empty array. It's going to have 0 items. So what happens is when you push an item into here is when you're going to have to then create the actual observable objects, properties that are observable on that item. Okay, so it's still up to you to construct the item in the collection. I think that's your question then. And you would then make those observable. So really this is unrelated to the mapping thing, I think. Okay, so I guess I don't have my let's do this. Let's take this code that I had. Here, let me take this in here. I'll go in the get older, after I push a kid in here, we'll then alert the JSON, just to show you what it would look like, okay? I think what's going to happen is, because the collection was originally there, an empty collection was originally there when you're doing the mapping, then its contents will also be part of the values that are tracked by the mapping. So let's just refresh this. Okay, we can call get older, and notice the kid shows up in there. Okay, so I think that is going to give you the behavior at least that you want. At least that's the behavior I would want. So, okay, looks like that's it for the questions. So thanks everybody for attending, and I guess. Thanks, and if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or with questions. Again, here's my contact information. But other than that, thanks for coming.